Beholden to destiny, decided by destiny. Animal test 60, carving waves. Surf's up, catching at the waves. Whoosh!
What's up guys? So I'm sure you may have heard there are some insane buffs for Mualani this patch, mostly in the form of Mona. Now what Mona does is with the new Hexerei buffs, together usually with Sucrose, virtually every buff Mona gives is useful to Mualani. And there's so many of these buffs that are spread amongst multiple multipliers, which leads to higher overall output than just flooding one stat with buffs. For example, in your old Mualani team, maybe something like this, you probably didn't even get any resonance here. But now with Mona, at the very minimum, you're getting Hydra Res, 25% max HP. Not only that, but as usual, you're getting 60% damage bonus from Omen. But now the Omen buff has been changed, so Mona has a much longer duration for it as long as you're doing normal attacks. Mona C1 got buffed to give extra vaporized damage bonus. Now you get a 1.6 times multiplier to that 15% now, so it's 24. Her C2 gives 80 EM now as well. Then her C4 got buffed. It no longer just gives 15% crit rate, but it also gives 15% crit damage. You might not have these constellations, but that's just an example of how much different buffs there are. Whereas one of the weaknesses of Xilonen, who is still a great teammate for Mualani by the way, even after these buffs, but Xilonen herself gives the 40% damage bonus from the scroll set, plus 36% elemental resistance shred, plus her being Geo let your pirate character use something like Archaic Petra set. These buffs are very nice, like the old team provided, but there were plenty of stats missing. And as always, you can learn about this a lot by going on the Akasha website. If you scroll down, you click on show substat priority and it shows you the amount of DPS you gain per substat. And one of the great things about Mualani is she can gain over 2% damage with 4 different stats, which is insane. HP, crit rate, crit damage, EM, these are all giving a ton of stats. So Mona's a bit different now. Before, when you play Mona, you just use her skill and her burst and you probably swap off. Now you have to utilize this extension mechanic, which basically means after you use her burst, every normal attack you do will extend it by 2 seconds. Now there's actually a bit of an issue with this because it can trigger once every 0.5 seconds. She attacks fast enough to where you might not get the full extension. But even if you're just doing 3 normal attacks or maybe 4 here, you're still getting at least 6% extra duration, which means your Omen went from 5 seconds to maybe 11 seconds, and that's still going to be more than enough for your Mualani. Remember, this weakness, this 5-second duration of Omen, is pretty much one of the only few downsides Mona had before, and now that these buffs have kind of fixed this, it's a big benefit to Mualani because it's not just his damage bonus. Pretty much all her buffs are reliant on this. When you're doing a normal attack, you activate her C2, giving you more EM. You're getting more crit rate, crit damage. So I can show a comparison again, the difference in damage on these new teams. So if I do a setup here, and I'll explain how to do these setups in a bit. But Mualani's first normal attack here, new team, 856. Second one, 856 again. Now when testing this old team, Mona actually gives you crit rate. So I need to change back to some crit rate pieces just to make it more of a fair comparison. And then I'll put Archaic Petra on MC here. So if I set up here, so I with Sucrose, pick up the Petra shard. 648. 648 again. And remember, that damage before was still pretty good. But if you do 856 divided by 648, 32% damage increase. Your bills might be slightly more, slightly less, but again, over a team that was already really good, that is insane. And you might get an even bigger damage increase if you weren't sweating, if you weren't using Archaic Petra here. It'll be even bigger. Anyway, you'll probably immediately notice one thing, which is now that you're replacing Xilonen, well, Xilonen was your healer, so you don't have a proper sustain. Well, what a lot of people have been doing is they've been giving Mona Prototype Amber, which does heal your team. But maybe you know about Prototype Amber, and maybe you think Prototype Amber isn't really that good. Well, let's do a healing comparison here. Xilonen's burst, getting about 6k heals. You're probably getting about the same. This is not a crazy Xilonen build, no signature, just giving us scrolls with defense pieces. Honestly, even if it might be even less if you don't have healing bonus, maybe you have crit rate for your Fav sword over here. First of all, that is single target healing, whereas Mona's burst, once you activate Prototype Amber, 4k. And those are procs to the whole team, by the way. You might be wondering, how am I getting 4k? First of all, I've got the Songs of the Days part set. Second of all, I've actually got a healing bonus circlet. And that's because the way Prototype Amber works is it uses your character's HP. So you get 18% of a character's HP. So Mualani has more HP, she'll actually get quite a lot. Sucrose has less, she'll get less. So the healing doesn't actually use Mona stats, except it does actually use healing bonus. So that 18% is actually times by 50, 18 times 1.5, and now it's actually 27% of your character's HP. So with this build here, you're actually healing a quarter of each teammate's HP each rotation, which is no joke. In fact, if I remove that healing bonus circlet just to see the difference, there we go. Now if I use Mona's burst, the procs are 3k. So the healing bonus circlet is way better healing. This set is not really for the healing though, but we'll get into it in a bit, why I'm using this exact set. But there is actually more to the healing discussion, which is that even though Xilonen heals more and she's a real sustain, Xilonen sustain did have a lot of issues. If you had played Mualani in harder content for the past few months, especially Stygian Onslaught, I'm sure you might have noticed one of the issues with Xilonen's sustain. Her healing is on her burst, which takes time, it does no damage, and it can even apply enough geo to ruin your setups. If you can help it, you basically never used her burst at all. And then what happens is when you needed healing, you maybe use her burst once every 3 rotations, and you usually use Xilonen's burst at the end after you've done Mualani's attacks, so in between rotations. So not only was that inconvenient, what it also meant is for usually 2/3 of your fights, you didn't actually have any sustain. Now, I'm not saying Mona's healing with Prototype Amber is strictly better, but the condition for Prototype Amber is just using your burst, and you're always going to use Mona's burst because it's a big damage increase. So you will regularly be healing your teammates. So you can argue in a way that Mona's healing can be better sometimes. Now let's get into the teams. I'm just going to say, I think this particular team is my favorite team overall. The general recommendation is you play Mualani, Mona, Sucrose, and then you either play the main character or you play Mavuika. They each have their own pros and cons, but I'm gonna say personally, I'm liking the benefits of PMC more. Some of the benefits, Pyro main character has faster rotations. He's also free, and you'll be surprised the buffs that you get. He's giving Mualani 15% extra damage in addition to the scroll set, whereas Mavuika, she also has the scroll set and she also has a damage buff, but it's this 40% that slowly ticks down. This team has a dead straightforward rotation. The setup is very simple. You just use Mona's skill and burst, then 4 normal attacks, then you hit the enemy with Pyro Traveler's skill, then you do Sucrose N1E or EN1, and then you see the big damage. And pay attention to that damage. So Mualani is doing 8-1-2. You can also do the very simple setup with Mavuika as well. So just use Mona's skill and burst again. But if you notice, Mavuika's damage buff that you're getting is a lot lower if you're not using her burst. Now I'll get onto different setups you can do with Mavuika later. But the neat thing about this Pyro Traveler team is it's theoretically possible to get this team for free. Pyro Traveler is free. In this patch, the Witch's Homework, you can actually get a free Sucrose. You could have also got Mona for free accidentally pulling, or you could have got her from the yearly 5-star selector, and you could have even gotten her constellations from here, from the Temper Thyself event, although I wouldn't really recommend that. Mona's constellations are definitely strong, but they're not definitely needed. This puts this team in the position where if you're looking at things from a cost perspective, if you have this team as the Mualani baseline and you want to improve your team, then you could just beeline straight to Mualani constellations, Mualani weapon, and very quickly you're going to get dolphin and whale level damage without even having to invest much into her team. Not only just pulls, but also artifact investment as well. The main character does no damage, he just needs a random scroll set. Sucrose, you just need VV and EM. So I'm just seeing it from an efficiency standpoint. This is probably one of the strongest teams in the game. The last advantage is obvious, but if you notice, this team doesn't really use super contested supports, especially a Mavuika team. If you're not playing Mavuika as your Pyro applicator, now that you don't have to play Xilonen anymore, whether you want to play an Overload Mavuika team or a Melt Mavuika team or whatever, you're pretty much clear to play any Mavuika team against another boss or against another Abyss side which indirectly makes this new team stronger as well. And not just Mavuika, but just most characters in general probably aren't using Mona, Sucrose, or Pyro Traveler. You can play so many modern teams. Anyway, enough about the glaze. Let's talk about some of the cons for this team, specifically with the Pyro main character. I think the biggest con is Pyro main character's AOE. So if I'm standing here and I use a skill, I didn't actually hit the enemy. There. So you have to be quite close for his AOE. And that's a big deal, not just in terms of AOE, but also in terms of your setup. It really means you desperately need to actually hit the enemy with his skill. So you want to hit that, get that hit there, or you'll eventually brick your setup. So if I set up, if I miss, just do that. Try and swallow the Hydro there, which I managed to get. And then you recover the damage. 812 is the same. The other issue is not new, it's always been an issue with PMC, is that in AoE content, he's been very reliant on Sucrose's burst absorbing Pyro to bolster his own Pyro app. And this is an issue that characters like Mavuika or Xilonen won't have because their Pyro is great AoE. So you want to get that Pyro absorption in AoE, otherwise you're usually kind of screwed. And lastly, the biggest weakness with this easy to play PMC team is that I haven't actually showed you Mualani's full combo yet. Enemies have been dying in 1 to 2 hits, but if I show you 3 hits, you'll notice that the buffs you get will expire for the 3rd hit. Your Mona's Omen buffs are going to drop off. Some of Sucrose's 8-second EM buffs might also drop off. 812 first hit. 812 second hit. What's his 3rd hit gonna be? 89k. Okay, that's a bit low. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, you're definitely not gonna get full buffs in this team. And that's where Mavuika comes in, because Mavuika, you can do more complex setups. So you see in the 3rd hit there, I didn't actually lose that much buffs. But what you also might have noticed is comparing to PMC's buffs, Mavuika's buffs with her burst are only slightly more. And again, because as I mentioned, the reason why that is the Pyro main character with his Constellation 1 gives you a permanent 15% damage increase. Whereas Mavuika with her burst buff, it starts at 40, but then it constantly decreases. And because you're using Mavuika's burst so early in your setups, by the time you actually do switch to Mualani, it's not that much higher than PMC's. Maybe even about the same, and then it will get even lower. One of the other benefits for this complex setup is Mona's ER requirements. Now I'm going to be honest, in a double Hydro team, and Mualani herself actually has pretty good energy generation, Mona's ER requirements aren't even that high. This is a bit excessive. But because you're splitting up Mona's skill and burst, and remember, Mona's skill has delayed energy generation. So it's not straight away, it actually only happens after it explodes. So by the time it explodes, your Mona has been on field, which can make this nicer in content like Stygian Onslaught. It's kind of a big deal, but it's also kind of not. Prototype Amber itself, not only does it heal your team, but it gives Mona herself 18 energy at refinement 5, and that 18 energy is stronger the lower energy cost the character has. So Mona has 60 energy cost, that's 30% of her burst cost for free just from this weapon. So unfortunately this team has some big drawbacks, and the biggest one might just be how tight the timing is with the complex setup. In fact, depending on the situation, it might be borderline unrealistic to even try to pull off. That is one of the issues with this team, is if the enemy moves around too much, because you used Mavuika's skills so early in your setup, it's very easy that you don't even vape your 3rd hit, at which point you didn't really take advantage that you have longer buff uptime. And the tight timing isn't just from enemies moving, but it's also from just getting hit. See, what if you get attacked there and then it screws up your setup? And then Mavuika's pyro. Maybe you get it on your second hit. Or am I even going to get it on my third hit? No. So the issues with having to stay on Mona and doing kind of full normal attack string, it can happen in any team, but the longer your setup is, like these complex setups, the more likely you are to run into issues. So those are the two main teams I recommend. You might be asking, what about Xilonen? Which brings me to another weakness of this team, which is the artifact set situation. I used to talk about this a lot, but one of the most important things you had to do in your Mualani teams is stacking your supports with as much buffs as possible. Having a buffing set on your first support, a buffing set on your second support, and there's no point having stuff like Emblem on your third character when you should be buffing your Mualani more. And that was one of the benefits that Xilonen had. Because she's Geo and because the setups are a lot more simple, it's easy to have scrolls on her, maybe a VV set, and then Instructor or Arcade Petra on your Pyro character. So the issue with Mona is that even though the buffs are really good, you're not actually fully optimizing your support sets. At least with Mavuika and Pyro Traveler, they could use the scroll set. Xilonen can't even do that. So Xilonen is a lot more handicapped in these new teams. So what buffing set can you actually give on Mona? Now, ideally, you'd use Instructor, and there are setups that will activate this. But for most casual play, I would probably say you're either using Songs of the Days Past or just using no set at all. Songs of the Days Past, when put on a healer, it does give your on-field character a damage buff. But the issue is this damage buff is quite bad compared to the normal buffing sets. Now, free damage is free damage, but to put into perspective how weak Songs of the Days Past is, it's about a 3% damage increase for Mualani. So 812, this is with Songs of the Days Past. 785. Yeah, just over 3%. That's equivalent to like a HP roll or a crit damage roll or an EM roll on Mualani. One extra EM roll, you might say. The Instructor set gives 6 EM rolls, meaning even with Instructor set's downsides, if your team could get even one of Mualani's hit buffed, that's a bigger overall damage increase than the whole of SODP. So here's a way how you can get the Instructor buff. So you basically add the Mavuika normal attack in. So apply Pyro there, Mona will vape. And look at that. That damage increase there is basically as good as Songs of the Days Past. So it is possible to do an Instructor setup. It's just a bit more tedious, and 4-star artifacts have less substats. So hopefully you have Instructor pieces with ER, but if you don't, it might be a bit more difficult to go out of your way for these. So there are a few things that you need to know when building this team. First of all, it's more difficult to build Mualani if you have Mona's C4, because in order to utilize this 15% crit rate, you need to have 15% crit rate to gain. So a normal Mualani build, maybe something like this. In your normal teams, when you build her, you get 40% extra crit rate, so you're at 93. Most Mualanis honestly probably have 100% crit rate, because all you need is 60 crit rate to hit 100. That means in these new teams, you need to have very good artifacts that don't necessarily have crit rate in them. The other thing about this team is that I have to say, don't go out of your way to farm Songs of the Days Past. I'm only using it because I already had a set, because I was grinding the Navia set a while ago, so I have these pieces already. If you don't have these pieces, even though you can get it in the strongbox, I would still say don't bother, because any resources that you put into the strongbox trying to get a set, you could have just put trying to improve Mualani's artifacts. Plus, even if you are farming Songs of the Days Past, even if you can get a healing bonus as in your off piece, you still want decent ER on your other pieces. You could probably get away with 210, 220 ER Mona in these teams, but even then it's not free. You're gonna have to dump in a lot of artifacts into the strongbox to get these like 17, maybe these 10 ER pieces. They're not easy to get. But on the plus side, if you're using PMC, he just needs any scroll set because his damage doesn't matter. Now where it would matter, these crit pieces on the scroll set, is if you're playing Mavuika instead. Also, I should say, Mualani's weapon can be an issue in these teams, Again, because of this 15% crit rate from Mona's C4, I don't have it, but if you had the battle pass weapon, I'm assuming at that point it's basically just unplayable. It was hard to build around the battle pass weapon before, but getting an extra 15% crit rate on top of that, it's probably not viable at all. One of the other issues with these new teams, I do have to say, is the length of the setups. Mona's combo does take quite a lot of time by itself. On top of that, if you're doing the complex setup with Mavuika's burst, that's going to be even longer time. In comparison, some of these old classic teams are so fast to set up. Which means depending on HP breakpoints, you may not actually be clearing enemies faster even though your damage is higher, just because the setups are a lot longer. I think that'll be less of an issue in like Stygian Onslaught, because in Stygian Onslaught the fights are so long that you really do want big damage boosts. But that is one of the reasons I like PMC here, is because you are still benefiting from Mona, but you're not getting a ridiculously long setup. One of the other issues is that this team is very debuff reliant. You've got Sucrose with her VV debuff, and now instead of Xilonen, you're using Mona with her Omen buffs. So it means a lot of this team's damage will not be carrying over to new enemies. So a team like this is less suited to multi-wave scenarios than the old teams. I did want to cover those weaknesses, but regardless, there are so many pros to these new teams that I do highly recommend. If you're a Mualani player, try Mona out, especially this new team. Mona, Sucrose, and then either the main character or Mavuika. Compare the damage versus your old teams, you'll be very pleasantly surprised. So Mualani mains, let me know if you're happy with these teams, and you'll definitely see some crazy gameplay from me in the future. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and thanks for watching.